Today is the big day. We'll finish our vest. We'll knit the collar, add it to the vest, then sew the side seams, and we'll be done. As a reminder, these videos cover sizes 40 and 42 finished chest. The written pattern, which is in the Vests with Men in Mind book, includes 9 sizes, 2 lengths, and 2 bulky gauges. It also includes some notes about knitting the design on a bond machine. The techniques are the same for both gauges and all sizes, so these movies will be helpful no matter what size and gauge you might be knitting. To prepare for the collar, sew the shoulder seams. Stitch the front and back together with the right sides of the fabric touching just behind the bind-off. Now, using whatever method you're using for ribbing, knit a piece that is 81 stitches wide and 28 rows long. Suggested stitch size is main stitch size minus 2 whole numbers, whether you are hand manipulating the ribbing or using a ribber to create it. Both the cast on and the bind off will show because one is going to be stitched to the neckline, the other will be the outer edge of the collar. A nice refinement for a really great fitting neckline is to start at main stitch size and gradually reduce the stitch size a click or 2 per row until you're at main stitch size minus 2. That will give us relaxed fabric the same gauge as the main knitting at the edge of the neckline, at the same time giving us a nice snug fit around the neck itself. The collar will be sewn to the neckline with its cast on or bound off edge along the dotted lines plus around the back of the neck. The row dimension is laid into the neckline across the part that we bound off to make the square bottom. The 2 layers will be sewn together there. For ladies, usually one overlaps right over left. For gentlemen, the opposite, left over right. The 81 stitches and 28 rows of the collar should fit around the neckline, overlapping the main sweater just to the outside edge of the neckline so as to be sewn into position. First pin, then baste the collar into position. An option for advanced knitters is to use the cast on as the outer edge of the collar. Scrap off, increasing stitch size to main stitch size at the very end of the knitting, and attach the collar to the garment fabric by stitching through the live stitches, then remove the waste yarn. But that is a relatively advanced option. I don't really recommend it for beginning and intermediate knitters. It's not exactly difficult to do. It is hard to see what you're doing. Knitters who don't feel up to working through live stitches just stretch the collar so that it evenly encircles the neckline, overlap the garment fabric slightly with the collar fabric, stitch next to the cast on or bind off so as to join the 2 fabrics, then overlap the 2 pieces of ribbing at the center front and sew them to the bottom of the neckline, and voila! You can make stitching just a little bit simpler by declaring that the neck edge that's going to touch the person is the cast on, and then knit 1 or 2 rows of plain knitting after the rib knitting. That's what I did here. That will mean your stitches are all facing the same direction when you go to stitch through them. I recommend back stitch for joining the collar to the main fabric. Here's a half-sized sample to allow you to see the collar being attached a little bit more clearly. First, we stretch the outer edge of the collar so that it aligns with the outer edge of the vest neckline, slightly overlapping the main fabric. In this case, I did knit 1 plain row and then bound off after creating the ribbing. Then ran a row of white basting yarn next to the bind off, and I am back stitching through the bind off. In this case, the purl side of the 1 row that was knitted plain is to the outside, the public side of the fabric. On the full-size sample, of course, I put the knit side of the extra plain row to the outside of the fabric. Just trying this out for variation. It's easy to see what stitches to back stitch into. And when you've stitched all around, of course, remove the white row of waste yarn. Using this method of stitching, that final plain row in the bind-off will show on the outside of the fabric. Knowing that this pattern is really quite suitable for beginners, except for the part about attaching the collar, I looked for a simpler way, and I think I found one. Using the same collar, the ribbing plus one plain row of stockinette plus the bind-off, but pinning the collar on so that the right sides of the two fabrics are touching one another. The right side of the garment itself is the knit side, and we're calling the right side of the collar the knit side of that one plain stockinette row at the edge, just before the bind-off. The collar is pinned all the way around the neckline just as before, but because of the way we have the things aligned, you can see both edges of fabric. The collar and the garment edge are both clearly visible, and we can stitch along right next to the bind-off into that final row of stockinette stitches and see what we're doing much more easily. And here's how it will look. On this half-size sample, which would fit an infant, it's proportioned wrong. In other words, I would not use a shawl collar on an infant, period, and certainly not in a worsted weight yarn, which this little sample is. But I think the proportion of the way the collar sits on the body of the garment is going to be just fine for an adult sweater. And if the difference between being able to make the vest and not make the vest is concern about the challenge of attaching the collar, I would definitely try this method. Across the bottom edge of the collar, where we bound off to create room for the collar, stitch the row dimension of the collar across the bound off stitches of the main garment. The collar should slightly overlap the main garment fabric. On the inside of the garment, whip stitch the other side of the collar to the lower edge of the garment's neckline. I like to whip stitch this lightly with only enough stitching to hold things together. The goal being not to make a thick, stiff spot. Ladies' collars are generally overlapped right over left, as this one is. Gentlemen's collars are generally overlapped left over right. The final finishing step is to sew the side seams from the underarm through the hem. I always like to hand wash the finished garment, lay it flat to dry before wearing it. If the yarn is one that lofts, that allows it to do so, plus you get out any lint, fiber residue, dust, etc. that may have been produced while knitting. If you're enjoying shawl collars, and they really are a comfortable thing to wear, plus good looking, you may like to know that there's a chapter just added to both gauge versions of the Answer Ladies Machine Knitting Notebook on adding a shawl collar to any sweater. Those who already own a copy of the notebook have been sent a notification to download an additional chapter, and those who buy the notebook from henceforth will automatically receive it. There's also a new video available for basic shawl collars for knitting machines, which will allow you to follow the instructions and create a shawl collar for any basic pattern. So have fun knitting and stay warm this winter.